Hello guys, happy end of March or start of April, depending on when you're watching this video lecture for this week. So this video lecture is for the topic in RESR 1311, Workshop 3 specifically, which is linked to citation and McGill citation requirements for your final brief memo assignment. So that means you'll be watching this short video lecture if you are preparing your workshop 3 for either the Monday section, the Tuesday section, which are March 30th and 31st, or the Thursday section, which is what? April 2nd for this week. Excuse me. So let's just jump right into the PowerPoint slide so you can start working on your workshop expectations for this week. So the first slide, or it's actually the second slide, the first slide I want to talk to you about is about in-text citation. These are some points that I've mentioned to you previously in class, and so I just want to clarify those now. Anytime you mention a statute or a case name throughout the entire document, it should be italicized. So this is even if you're including it in the footnote citation itself or anywhere in the body of the text. That case name or that statute name should be italicized. Every time that you summarize or paraphrase or quote from a source, you need to footnote that. So we've talked about this before, not just this semester, but last semester as well. Anytime you take an idea that comes from a different source, an idea that's not originally from your head, that needs to be footnoted, even if it's in your own words, okay? So anytime you summarize or are paraphrasing or are quoting, you need to have a footnote. Of course, if you're quoting directly, you need to have those quotes around the exact words as well. Statutes should also be quoted word for word. This is just a good rule of thumb. Of course, it's okay to paraphrase a statute sometimes, but when you're writing, I should say, for an important legal matter, such as the brief legal memo, you want to make sure you have that wording of the statute correct so that the reader is able to apply that to their knowledge in their brain as accurately as possible, okay? So statutes are, good rule of thumb, best quoted word for word. Cases may be paraphrased, and of course, you know that you can pull the ratio out of a case as well, and so that would be your own wording. Although the thought would come from the case, it would still be footnoted. Anytime you're using a judge's words, word for word, of course, those need to be quoted and footnoted, okay? If you're quoting the same source more than once, it is entirely appropriate to use a short form. So you can just determine what that is, however that best works for you. Sometimes if you're using the same case as it's gone through the court system, so an appeal level case, sometimes it's hard to use the name of one of the parties as the short form. So sometimes in that case, it's best to use a short citation or the year of the case. So that it's obvious that there's a differentiation there between the different levels of court that case was heard before. Otherwise, it's appropriate to use a short form of the case name. So for a case like Brown versus McCarty, you might just call it quote Brown or quote McCarty after the first time that you've cited it or stated it in your text or even in the footnote. Same for legislation. So it's entirely appropriate to use a short form for a legislation. The example I give you in the slides is the Highway Traffic Act, short form to HTA. The first time you would mention that then, you would put the Highway Traffic Act, and then in brackets just after the Highway Traffic Act, you'd put HTA in quotes. And that's an indicator to the reader that that's the way that source will always be referred to as going forward in the text, okay? There are some examples on slide 3 of what IBID and SUPRA might look like. So I would encourage you to look at those examples, but also please refer to the McGill guide. If you don't have the full McGill guide, I have reposted for you just in the last few days the library version of the McGill guide. So that's now under the workshop 3 content, this week's content on your DC Connect page, all right? So where do our citations come into our memo? Probably not in the facts section. So if we're going to work through this section by section, facts is the first section that you see in your brief memo. You're probably not going to have anything cited there because you're not mentioning legislation or case law here. These are actually the facts of the case, your client's facts, the scenario, the way that their lifestyle is somehow coming into, I guess, connection with the law at this point. We don't know yet what the law is, so here you're just laying out the facts of the case, right, for the reader. So you're probably not going to have anything footnoted in the facts of the case. It would be very unlikely. The issue section could be the first place that you have a footnote appear. And this is because oftentimes in our issue statement, we have the name of the legislation that applies to the scenario. And I've given you a discussion about this before when we were working in workshop 1 about drafting issue statements and how there should be a piece of the law in your issue statement or issue question somewhere. So again, for example, on the slides, this is at slide 6, in the PowerPoints, it mentions the Residential Tenancies Act. This is the first time the piece of legislation is mentioned in our memo. Therefore, that has to be footnoted. It's the very first time it's mentioned. It needs to be footnoted, okay? After the issue statement, depending on how your issue statement was worded, because I know that there are some of you whom I approved issue statements for without an explicit reference to legislation in there, okay? So it could possibly be for you that the law section is the first place where your statute is mentioned for the first time. Even if it's not the first place where it's mentioned, you might find that you need to footnote your law in this section as well, even if you previously footnoted it in the issue section. And that's because this is where you're pinpointing to a very specific section of the Residential Tenancies Act or Rules of Civil Procedure, whereas your issue statement might not have been specific to that section. Okay, so more likely than not, we're going to see footnotes arising out of your law section as well, specifically where you're naming the law and stating the law, okay? When you're stating the law, again, this is a reminder for you because we have discussed it. For lengthy quotes, anytime you're quoting legislation specifically, these should be single-spaced and indented, and you actually don't use the quotation marks around the top and the bottom of that quote, and you footnote the end of it, okay? There's an example on slide 10. That slide also suggests that you should cite your legislation first. And that's just a good rule of thumb again. So in your law section, it's best to start off with the statute law and then flow through to the case law after that. So if yours is mixed up right now, you won't get marks off for stating the case law first and then stating the statute law, but it is just good practice to have the statute law stated first, okay? And then in that law section, when you're stating the excerpt from the statute, you should be citing there the most relevant section of the statute, the one that most applies, right? Same with cases. If you're going to state a summary of the case or a ratio of the case in your law section, if you could just be sure that you're taking a quote or a summary that best describes the reason why you're using the case. If you just go to the very end that says the appeal was allowed or the appeal was denied, that doesn't tell the reader what the basis of the case was about. So you just need to be pulling a quote from that case or paraphrasing the case in a way that best identifies for the reader what the purpose of this case is. Why do you even have this case included here? Okay, so make sure your quote is, or your summary is actually reflecting that. Citations may or may not be necessary in the analysis piece. So on one of the slides in the PowerPoint, it says it's definitely necessary, and it would be if, again, you're specifically referring to a section of a specific statute that you want to apply or specific paragraph in a case that you want to apply. But otherwise, if you're just saying the RTA again or the HTA again or the Rules of Civil Procedure again, and you've already footnoted that above, there's no real reason to have to footnote that again. Okay, the only time you would footnote it again is if you're referring to a very specific section or a different section than something you've already mentioned above, which you probably shouldn't be, because all of the specific sections you're applying should appear in the law area, okay? Remember though, in the application piece or the discussion piece, whichever you call it, application, discussion, analysis, you probably will be stating throughout your body of the content legislation names or case names that you're referring to, again, the short forms. So make sure that you are italicizing those short forms of the names, right? Secondary sources, this is just a word if you're using a secondary source or referring to it somehow. They're going to appear slightly different in your footnotes than they appear in your bibliography. In your footnotes, I would see the author's name, first name, then last name, then comma, and then the rest of that secondary source requirement as per McGill. So the name of the secondary source and the publication date and place and all that. In the bibliography, it's opposite. So the bibliography runs by author's last name, comma, first name, followed by a period, and then the rest flows thereafter. So footnote, author's first name, last name, bibliography, author's last name, first name. Okay, so they're flipped there. So just something to be mindful of. I'm not sure that many of you will be using a secondary source in your memo, but if you are, be aware of that. And then slide 17 specifically lays out for you what the bibliography should look like according to the McGill standard. And I think you are familiar with this somewhat. Some of you have already utilized this method. I know in assignments for me, some of you perhaps you haven't. So just make sure you're breaking down your bibliography according to legislation, jurisprudence or cases, and secondary material or secondary sources. And then according to the bibliography for McGill standards, all of that is actually centered down the center of the page. So you can have a look at the example that is posted again at slide 17 of the PowerPoint. You can also refer to the McGill handbook that's on DC Connect that I posted because it gives you a nice example of it there as well. So it's actually this piece that I'm looking for in workshop 3. I'm looking to see your bibliography. So this is what you should be focusing your time on in your workshop this week, and you should be submitting this at the end of your class time for this week. So the 5% of your workshop deliverable is for your McGill bibliography, properly formatted. So this is going to be due at the end of your workshop time. So again, for Monday class, that's 12 p.m. on DC Connect. On your Tuesday class, that's 2 p.m. And on your Thursday class, that's 4 p.m. at DC Connect. You can also include, if you've got that far, your entire memo with the footnotes and I guess the footnotes included in your body of your text and at the bottom of the page. And I can also review those at that time and let you know if that looks good or that doesn't look good. But again, your 5% mark comes directly out of your bibliography, okay, and how that's formatted. I should just clarify, if you are submitting the rest of your documents so that I can review your footnotes as well, the rest of your document doesn't have to be perfect. That's what you work on over this week and next week for your final submission, okay? So your final submission of the entire brief memo is next week at the end of class time. So just to confirm again, those dates are April 6th for the Monday class, April 7th for the Tuesday class, and April 9th for the Thursday class, okay? That's all, guys. I'll chat with you during your class discussions this week. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.